George Friedman, welcome. This is a great pleasure for me. I've been a fan of your stuff for a long, long time. Read books, read research reports, and I'm always just so engaged in how you write about things in such an accessible way for ordinary guys like me to try and understand this crazy geopolitical world. There's so many things I want to ask you about, and I'm going to jump right in with a really bizarre one, which is Poland. Because when I read The Next 100 Years, I was really struck by what you said about Poland, because it never occurred to me in a million years. Could you just talk a little bit about your thesis around Poland, why it's so important? Because I think it's such a different take on things.
Well, firstly, Russia has weakened dramatically and is continuing to weaken in a kind of waving downward pattern. Germany's unsustainable. Germany's unsustainable, this level of exports. Both are going to weaken for economic reasons, but also social reasons. Poland is therefore left standing. It will be, for the first time in centuries, without a threat from the east to the west. It is already the organizing entity for what used to be called Eastern Europe. And it has a remarkable growth rate record over the past 10 years. It is one of the few countries that has a relatively decent birth rate, and it has, as a social organizing principle, the Catholic Church. So when you take a look at all these things and you understand the weaknesses of those around them, Poland emerges, and has already emerged in the recent crisis in Ukraine as the critical player.
And how does Poland being a critical player, how does that affect the dynamics in that region? Because it was a critical player, but not for such a long time that most people have kind of forgotten when it was in its pomp.
Think about the European peninsula, which is kind of a line you draw from St. Petersburg to Rostov-on-Don. Everything to the east of it is the mainland, everything to the west is the peninsula. The easternmost country of that peninsula is, in a way, Poland, right behind the Baltics. When the Russians are strong, they're the first ones to be affected. When the Germans are strong, they're the first ones to be affected. So the dynamic here is that for the first time in 4 centuries, you're going to see a Poland which is not simply victim. And in not doing that, it can take that part of Europe, which is not, if you will, exhausted, and organize it. You have to remember, Germany and Russia have gone through hell. As a society, if you think of societies as people, I mean, they are both post-traumatic stress disorder. But it's a reasonable thing. I mean, look what they've done, look what they've been through. Poland as well. But Poland has a vigor and a nationalism that you don't really find in Germany, and you don't find as healthily in Russia. And so, for various reasons, I mean, when you take a look at Europe, I mean, you take a look at Western Europe, I mean, what is really left to have the energy to define? When you take a look at the East, what has the weight? I mean, you're in a situation here where the consequences of 1945 are still being played out in Europe. They deluded themselves between 1992 and 2008 in thinking, well, you know, we've all managed to dodge the bullet. But as hard times come, and you look at it carefully, you can see that they're not dodging the bullet very well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm English, but we're kind of Europeans, I guess. But I've grown up understanding that within this big European family, there are cultural schisms that you just can't. They don't go away.
Well, they're cultural and their interests. I mean, the British have played a very smart game. They've put a foot into Europe. They haven't committed to Europe. They maintain a relationship with the United States. They're not irrevocable relations. It's sort of what the British did during their height. They played the balance of power by manipulating others. Now they manipulate others by being between them and managing them. But the British came out of that war both in disarray, but still with their national sensibility intact, which is why the Scottish vote was so stunning. That's an interesting thing to absorb. But it's not so much only the cultures that are different. It is the level of energy that's left. So when the Russians moved into Ukraine, most people that I've spoken to from the West really didn't care, really didn't want to get involved. Not so those on the border. They're made of different fiber and have different interests.
Yeah, I mean, so when you talk about that Russian incursion into Ukraine, Crimea kind of came and went with a bit of noise, but I think people realized, you know what, we kind of have to give that to them. We'll let them have that one.
Well, we couldn't take it away from them.
Right.
they were there.
But it kind of happened, and there was a lot of noise about it, but it died down very quickly. The Ukraine
But notice the Americans didn't die down. The Americans have been working with the Poles, with the Romanians, pre-positioning equipment in this region, doing maneuvers in the Baltics. So here's the difference. We used to have a transatlantic relationship. From the American point of view, it doesn't exist anymore. You can't have military alliance without militaries. The U.S. has relations with various countries. So what's interesting is from the European point of view, it all kind of died down.
Right.
But right now you have American and Canadian troops training in the Ukraine. You don't have German, you don't have French, you don't have Spanish. So it's not that the crisis has died down. It is the European sensibility was dialed down, so that was no longer affected.
But doesn't that become a problem? I mean, the Baltic nations obviously feel incredibly threatened by Russia. There's an awful lot of provocation on both sides. Perhaps the Russian provocation is more overt because they fly into the airspace, whereas there's an awful lot of stuff going on the ground from the West that is incredibly...
there is a pre-war going on with both sides. Each side is testing the other, trying to provoke each other. But when it's interesting to define the sides, you have the Baltics, you have Poland, you have Romania, you have the United States. Perhaps you'll have the Turks, perhaps not, right? Who don't you have? The Germans, the Italians, the Danes, and so on. So you do have a lot of Scandinavia. Finland and Sweden are quite concerned. So there's a new map of Europe emerging, driven by the perceived Russian threat. And you really can't, people, who is right or wrong? Look, Russia has got to have Ukraine. Ukraine is fundamental to its national interests. The United States, for a century, has had a fixed foreign policy on one principle. No European hegemon should dominate all of Europe. We went into the First World War, the Second World War, the Cold War about this. When the Russians start pursuing their national interest, we will immediately be triggered. And that's what's happening. It's not who's right or who's wrong, you can argue it either way. It is the fact that if the Russians are going to act the way they did in Ukraine, the U.S. will respond. If the U.S. is going to act the way it did in Kiev, the Russians will respond. And so it makes a great deal of sense just to look at the game and understand what each player is doing. And so when we talk about European alliances, well, we don't include Germany in that. We don't include France very much. We really are talking about the Americans developing a new, I call it the Indomarium. The Indomarium is an alliance system that General Pilsudski, Joseph Pilsudski of Poland, envisioned. And it ran from the Baltic to the Black Sea. And it was designed to do two things. One, contain the Russians. Two, contain the Germans. And what you see emerging is that. So the two pillars of this are Romania and Poland. The Americans are intensifying their relationship with both as the guarantor. And the rest of Europe is sort of standing out.
It's interesting you bring up Germany. We've kind of heard that name a little bit there. Obviously, switching topics a little bit, Germany is now at the fulcrum of this whole revolving circus that's going on in Europe now. They're potentially the biggest loser from a Greek default in terms of money. They seem to be in a pretty bad situation. That's not how the narrative is generally, but it feels to me like the Germans are in a very, very bad situation. How do you see the Greece-Germany situation playing out?
Well, it's interesting that it's turned into the Greece-Germany situation because it's really not about that. But it's being played out by various sides that way. The real issue is that Germany exports more than 50% of its GDP. That's unsustainable. If that declines at all, then the Germans are going to have unemployment. The Germans are afraid of unemployment and the social consequences. For that to not decline, they have to have a free trade zone. and half of their goods go into the European free trade zone, which preceded the euro and everything else. And ultimately, you have to really simplify this to the fundamental problem. Germany is addicted to exports. It can't give up access to those exports. The Southern Europeans need to have some mechanism to limit German exports, otherwise they can't develop. The European Union makes that impossible. So Germany is in a terrific fix because in the end it's gotten itself into an economic position that's unsustainable and a political position that can't endure. You're not going to have this go on forever. The Greeks are relatively unemployed. I mean, what is important is the entire periphery of Europe is simply not benefiting from this free trade zone or from the euro or from other things. And so they're going to have to do something about it. I mean, the problem of the European Union is that it promised two things: peace and prosperity. In the end, the United States was very similar to Europe. There was a great disagreement between the North and the South about various policies. We held a conference for 3 days in Gettysburg, and at that conference it was decided the North was right. Who would die for the European Union? So this is the fundamental problem. To create a sovereign entity or a pseudo-sovereign entity that no one has any moral commitment to beyond what they get out of it, that can't last.
Yeah, I agree. And this is, I think, what I get from being British and understanding that when push comes to shove, the Germans have antipathy towards the Spanish have antipathy towards the Italians, and those cultural schisms, as I mentioned, they don't go away.
But it's also this entity, this thing, this European Union. Yeah. It is not a nation. All it is a treaty.
Yep.
It's nothing more than a treaty that can be withdrawn.
It's a rewrite of a treaty. It's even worse.
It's a treaty organization. No one's given up their sovereignty. No one has given their prior commitment to the euro except for the hedge funds or something. Yeah. But I mean, Greeks fought and died for, against the Germans, then against the Soviets, or for the Soviets, or whatever way. The problem of the European Union is what it promised was all the good things and asked for nothing.
But the problem is, it seems like the politicians will die for this European dream. They're the only people willing.
There's a class of politicians who built their careers since 1992 around the European Union. But Papandreou was one of those, and he got 5% of the vote in the last election. So the ability of the mainstream politicians to survive the Syrizas, the Podemos, the others, is very much in question. The question is really, what's important is what comes after them. So what you have in Europe right now is kind of an alliance between the financial community, the mainstream politicians, and what I'll call the Financial Times, just to symbolize it, not to blame them or anything like that. And they have a picture of what this crisis is about, which is that this is basically a financial crisis, which it certainly was and continues to be in some sense. You have another Europe that envisions this as a massive social breakdown. And it's not just the Greeks. They don't speak to each other. They don't hear each other. I feel sort of like Marie Antoinette when I hear some of the things that are said in the elite community about what Greece should do. And that builds up a feeling among the Greeks that they have no commitment to Europe. And this is the problem. You can't have an international organization like this in which your only commitment to it is your obligation to pay debts. Right. There's got to be more. And Europe can't provide that.
I mean, the famous Grexit, it seems as though it's been baked in the cake. To me, anyway, for a long, long time, it seemed inevitable to me that they would be forced to leave. What is this compulsion? Is it financially driven, or is it this grand dream, this compulsion to keep this thing together, no matter what the cost to society?
Well, for the Germans, it's a fundamental basis of their well-being. That free trade zone,
right? Economic.
Their ability to control the currency to their ultimate interest. I mean, this is their brute national interest, if you will, coming forward. I understand their point of view. The French and the others are much more wary, and have always been much more wary of this whole idea. Okay? Others are trying to make their decisions based on what's in their interest, the Greeks and so on. But for the European elite, the euro has somehow become something mystical. Yeah. Will they leave the euro? Well, let's assume they did leave the euro, or didn't. They're still not going to pay their debts.
Sure.
I mean, whether they don't pay them in euro, or they pay them by printing worthless money and paying them in that, they're not going to be able to pay it. Europe's inability to face the fact that it made bad loans, and that when you make bad loans, it is the creditor who swallows it. And the idea that it's somehow going to get the Greeks to agree to be squeezed. Now, what will happen probably is there'll be some sort of agreement, which will be signed, and then nobody will follow it. You can't squeeze the Greeks. But what I don't understand, I truly don't, is the European fixation on the euro. Who cares?
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, you're absolutely right. And it seems an awfully flimsy construct to watch societies tear apart like they're doing.
Well, I mean, you have a currency, you control it, you price it at something optimal for you, or you don't. I understand why the Germans want the euro, yeah. But I don't understand why the Eurocratic parties want the euro. But part of it is such a deep fixation on this idea of European unification that they can't face when it's over. It didn't work. And they're going to make it worse, because rather than thinking about ways to solve the problem, they can't. They cannot embrace the idea that the creditors sometimes
lose money.
Have to lose money. From the Greek point of view, after the example of Argentina and American Airlines, yeah. I mean, they're having a lot of trouble understanding why they should at this point pay it back.
But where's France on this? Because France has been conspicuously quiet in this. I mean, they should be a big voice at that table.
Well, Hollande knows that he has on his right two parties. And he's desperately trying to not have a left-wing party come up to get him. The National Front is fundamentally flawed, simply by its leadership. Mm-hmm. If it didn't have Le Pen's.
Yeah, had the family.
If it wasn't a family enterprise.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, they've been there for a long time. Also, France is not doing well, but it's not suffering. It's not doing the 15, 20% that other nations are. And it gets tremendous concessions, and it ignores most of the regulations. So unlike other countries which feel constrained to obey them, they're not going to balance their budget if they don't want to. So they can afford to be silent because, I mean, what are the Germans going to do, invade?
Yeah, they didn't work out so well last time. Well, you mentioned Scotland earlier on briefly, and that was something, as a Brit, I found that whole thing really, really interesting, because the whole reason the United Kingdom came together in the first place is because Scotland needed a bailout, essentially. And here they are trying to...
You had a few Bozemen trying to persuade them as well.
Yes. But that desire for independence on the part of the Scots, we're seeing it in parts of Spain. Is this secessionist movement, is this a reflection of something or the start of a new trend?
We've been in a devolutionary period since 1918, when the Habsburgs collapsed and all these new nations were created. We went into another devolutionary period when the Soviet Union collapsed, and you saw the old Yugoslavian countries and so on. European nationalism is based on a theory of identity, of language and culture and religion. And each fragment has the right to national self-determination. And so when you have a fragment that has a different culture, that has a different religion, a different history, a different language even, the idea is that they morally have the right to be independent, that they have a moral right to national self-determination. And the result of that is that this process has been going on for a century is actually grinding it smaller and smaller and smaller. And I don't think we're quite on the point of a major devolution in all these areas. But as the economic crisis wears on, it'll start to make sense. I mean, a great deal of what happened in Scotland was they simply didn't see any sense of sharing Great Britain's burden. Part of it didn't make any sense. Part of it was simply the novelty of the idea. But, you know, you talk about Catalonia, you talk about Transylvania, that's distant. The Scots are leaving the United Kingdom. Yeah. I mean, that was a startling moment. And that they came that close.
Yeah, because it was really close. I mean, that was the thing. I don't think people realized. The headlines were handily defeated, but it was a very close thing.
Well, it was because for a few days there, it looked like they'd win. And then everybody was so relieved that it was only 45%.
What do you think would have happened? I know there's no point talking about it in many ways, but what do you think would have happened had that referendum gone the other way? Because it would have had much wider ramifications.
Well, I think what would have happened is that you would have had a huge crisis between Britain and Scotland over debt. Mm-hmm. Who owes what?
Yes. Yeah.
And that was going to drive nationalism pretty intensely because the Scots have a different understanding of what happened than the English do. I think it would have also become a marker for European nationalism because that was inconceivable 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 2 years ago, 6 months ago. And then it almost happened. Had it happened, I mean, it would have changed what is possible in not all parts of the world, I think. But certainly in Europe, it would have legitimized nationalist sub-movements all over the place. It was fortunate, I think, that it didn't happen, because I think at this point in history, it would have kicked off something that the Europeans can't cope with.
But once that toothpaste's out of the tube, it's hard to see there not being another referendum at some point.
I suspect there will be, but it was interesting that the way it happened was it seemed to be an affirmation that it wouldn't happen.
Right.
See, they didn't leave. Mm-hmm. So long as that happens, that's fine. And the Scots seemed a bit relieved too.
Yeah, they were.
I think what happened was they realized, oh my God, we're going to do this. And nobody knew what it would mean.
Yeah. I spoke to some very, very smart Scottish friends of mine who I was amazed were pro-separation, which I couldn't believe.
And what were their reasons?
Well, interesting enough, the reasons seemed to be coalescing around the Scots being an angry teenager who said, you know, I want independence. And it's like, okay, off you go. I said, yeah, but the kids can always move back in with the parents if it goes wrong. Scotland can't move back in with, you know, England and Wales and Ireland if things don't work out for them.
Well, it was from the American point of view, it was unnoticed until about a week before.
Okay,
and then suddenly it was noticed, and everybody, you know, nobody knew what to make of it.
Sure.
There wasn't. This is one of the rare things in the world that the Americans had no position on.
Right.
You know, on the whole, when I talk to some people in Washington, I guess we're opposed to it. I don't know. We actually have some bases, I believe, in Scotland that matter to us a great deal.
Naval bases, for sure.
And the only thing that came up was in DOD, talking to some guys. The question was, are the Scots going to let us keep those bases? And, you know, nobody knew. So then an interesting conversation happened. Who should we call? Okay, who's the Scottish defense minister going to be? And we all went back and we don't know. And then somebody said, I don't think the Scots have thought of this.
Yes, well, you know what, you're probably right.
I don't think the Scots have a policy on American bases.
Yeah, I mean, how could they have? As you said, it was just inconceivable a short time before.
It was, the Catalonians do have a clear understanding of what they want and why they want it. But they've thought about this a lot
for a
longer.
long time. Yeah.
This just sort of came up out of nowhere.
Just switching gears a little bit, I want to move to Asia, where I live, because I'm fascinated by the Japan-China dynamic. And again, it's one of those regional conflicts that's bubbled away for a long time. And the problem, if it ever really flares up, we've seen these little skirmishes over the Senkaku Islands and all these seemingly ridiculous arguments over rocks then the oil and gas story emerged, and we kind of get it a little bit. But just talk a little bit about the level of animus between those two countries, because I think that's a lot more dangerous than people perhaps realize.
Well, I mean, the animus arises from the 19th century. Yeah. I mean, these two countries, the British created a dynamic that flowed forward. The Japanese did not want to import workers, so it exported factories. And that led to a whole dynamic between the two. The problem the Chinese have is they can't go to war. They don't have a navy. Yes, they have ships, yeah. But you can't fight with ships. You have to fight with fleets. And in a carrier battle group, for example, you have to train the admiral by another admiral who knows how to do this. And so, as we say, yeah, the Chinese have platforms. And they might even be able to take off from one and land on one. But deploying a carrier battle group is an enormously complex undertaking. The Chinese are practicing now with a couple of ships at distance on anti-piracy control. And they're discovering the difficulty of supplying them. Well, the Americans have spent nearly the past century thinking about carrier battle groups, yeah, and sea lane control. So have the Japanese. The Japanese do have admirals who learn from admirals. They do have a naval tradition. So, you know, people talk about wars as if, you know, they were close enough together to decide to do it. Yeah. It's very difficult for China to fight a war. Internally, it's trapped by geography. The People's Liberation Army is an internal security force. It can't, they have nowhere to attack. They can't attack India across the Himalayas. People say these insane things about the Indian-Chinese balance of power. They may as well live on the moon. You know, yeah, how do you fight across the Himalayas? Yeah, maybe a platoon can shoot, but you can't attack across the Himalayas. The real power in Asia is Japan, by far. They not only have none of the social problems of the Chinese, they are really the world's third largest economy. And depending on how you read the Chinese stats, they may be the second. They're stable. They have an excellent navy, a fine air force. And this is while they're pacifists.
But they have a very nationalistic prime minister now.
Well, yes, but they are very nationalistic people. The new mood of Japan has stayed steady. The prime ministers have changed. The Japanese are not itching for a fight with anyone. But their real problem isn't China. China doesn't threaten them. The United States does. Japan imports raw materials from all over Asia and the Indian Ocean basin, all through waters controlled by the U.S. Navy. The U.S. is casual. If it wants to have a crisis against Iran, it'll have one in the Straits of Hormuz without any consideration to the Japanese needing oil. The United States is not very thoughtful. And this makes the Japanese extremely uncomfortable by the fact that in crises, they don't really have a seat at the table. The Australians have more of a seat at the American table. And so the rational move for the Japanese to make is to move to be more supportive of the United States, to create a dependence on the part of the United States on the Japanese. The Australians have limited things they can give. They can, however, provide SAS forces, which are excellent and badly needed in the kind of wars. They have a decent air force, and it's growing. The Japanese have not offered any of these things. They didn't want to fight in any American lunacy that we come up with. And the way to get influence with the United States, who is the fundamental guarantor of Japanese access to raw materials and to their markets, is to align yourself with the United States. And I think when we talk about Abe and his nationalism, it's more subtle than that. He's not really talking about, you know, Japan creating a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. What he is talking about is participating more in American activities. And he's put it that way, you know, to send minesweepers, whatever is needed. because he's realized that the Americans are really deaf to him in a crisis, to the Japanese. Now, as the Japanese move further in this direction and become more aggressive, the Chinese become more nervous. But the problem with the Chinese is it's very hard for them to take offensive action. This is a landlocked nation, by and large. It has rarely floated a naval force. And geographically, it's just isolated from the rest of the world. And so when you think about that, you really start to realize that as in World War II and other places, there may have been the China-Japanese dynamic in war, but it was really the Americans that were going to decide how this played out. And I think what Abe wants to do is make sure that he has a seat at the table.
What about, as we're in that region, what about North Korea? Whose problem is that? Is that South Korea's problem, or is it China's problem? Or is it nobody's problem?
Well, I mean, we aren't actually dealing with a broken car here.
No.
We're dealing with so it's not a problem. We're dealing with North Korea, who has used the development of nuclear weapons as a wonderful bargaining tool to extract concessions, including money, from foreign countries. They have a wonderful strategy. Iran has learned from it, which is that if you want to get the American attention, fool around with uranium. Now you've got our undivided attention. Now, begin to be totally irrational, and then become fierce, okay? And then look like you're collapsing. So if he's collapsing, there's nothing we have to do. If he's fierce and crazy, we better not screw with him. On the other hand, maybe if we give him $2 billion worth of something, he'll leave us alone. And they will. So I don't take the North Koreans have one goal. Very rationally they pursue it: regime survival.
Right.
Okay? The possession of almost having a nuclear weapon keeps the United States from having to do something, while at the same time guaranteeing the American attention to their needs. So you take a look at this. This is a country, a miserable little country. It sits and negotiates with the Chinese, the Russians, the Japanese, the Americans, and the South Koreans. This is very cool. This is very, very cool. And has survived when it had no business surviving. This is a very impressive country. Now, what is the problem with North Korea? Nothing that a couple of billion every 5 years won't cure. So, again, the Americans like to define things as problems, and because they can then find a solution. The Chinese love the North Koreans because every time the Americans really push on the Chinese, the North Koreans do something atrocious. Then the Americans run to the Chinese to get them to stop. The North Koreans stop, and then the Chinese say to the Americans, I mean, look what we just did for you. What are you pushing me on? Do you want? You know. So the Chinese find the North Koreans useful. The Japanese would love to do something about them, but they're not going to. So we don't have a Korean problem. We have a Korean reality.
So you think that the regime does survive?
I would have bet against it all along. I had been wrong If it survived this far, I see no reason why it shouldn't survive another 10, 20 years. In the end, can't survive. But then remember, the one country that is most committed to the survival of this regime is South Korea.
Yeah.
The last thing the South Koreans want is to repeat the German experience and have to take over the North Korean debt and things like that. So there's nobody who wants the regime to really go away.
Right. Except the citizens, I guess, but they don't even know they want it to go away.
Well, you know, the interesting thing is I don't even know what the citizens think. I mean, it's a country where you really can't tell what actually is being thought. You always expect there to be an uprising. There never is. The ruling family gets stranger and stranger as you go along. But in the end, you've asked the question, whose problem is it? I'm not sure it's a problem. It's a reality.
Just in closing, I want to come back to the US. We're sitting here in San Diego. We're just going into a new election cycle. It's something like 10 minutes since the last one. What's your take on what's going to happen in this? Because we don't really know what...
We will elect a new president.
Yeah.
and it will make no difference. We elected Barack Obama. He wanted to be something wonderful. He got the Nobel Prize for being wonderful. Everybody expects, he is the President of the United States, and as such, there are certain things he must do. It is the national interest of the United States that he not have a close relationship to the Germans, that he manage the Iraq situation as well as he can. He was handed that problem by George W. Bush. Bill Clinton handed George W. Bush the problem of al-Qaeda by not taking care of it. George Bush Sr. handed Clinton the problem of al-Qaeda after Desert Storm. So presidents don't get to come into office and kind of decide, okay, I'm going to be this or that. They get to decide what speeches they make. That's fine. But if you take a look at the presidency Barack Obama had and what he spoke of and what he genuinely intended, I don't think he was a hypocrite. You realize it doesn't matter who's elected because they are so constrained by reality that they don't have choices. They're moving as they must. And the same with British prime ministers.
Well, that I've seen up close. One thing just occurred to me there. Edward Snowden, hero, traitor, where do you see that? Because it's such a rigid line between people.
Edward Snowden signed a pledge, which he didn't have to sign, that doesn't bind other citizens. And that pledge pledged him to maintain state secrets. It didn't say, unless you disagree with them. So, I mean, with Edward Snowden, I mean, we are not talking about a person, an American citizen, who got hold of this stuff and published it. We're talking about a person who was a contractor / employee of the NSA, signed some rigorous security statements, didn't have to do it. So I don't think it's ambiguous what he is. Now, you may argue that it's good that we found out, or it isn't good we found out. But very truthfully, is there anybody who didn't know that the NSA was spying? The NSA, if you read the legislation that created it, is there to spy. That it is collecting phone, well, what satellites do you think we've put up? So, I mean, there's kind of a willful pretense of shock. The Germans in particular were touching. Shocked, they said.
They're still reporting it in Der Spiegel every week. There's stories about this.
And fine, and they do. But do you think that the German intelligence services weren't given material from what was downloaded?
But it's one of these. If you don't, once it's out in the open and it's acknowledged as a fact, you kind of have to confront it. I think we all knew.
Well, it was, and the United States confronted it, and it continues doing it.
But did you think this is the start of something in terms of outrage of public that are being spied?
How long ago did Snowden happen?
Well, yeah, no, and this is, I agree.
So my point is, well, it clearly wasn't the start of anything because in the United States, at least, there were people who were outraged to discover the NSA was in business, but by and large, the public said, yeah.
Yeah, it just died down. Well, and I'm quite surprised about that, to be honest.
Well, if you are hunting al-Qaeda and you really don't want to be attacked, how do you do it? I mean, what do? You try to find, they are sparse, they're global, and they can't be distinguished from the rest of the population. You have a basic choice. There are no good strategies, but every strategy is going to violate privacy.
Right.
Because by definition, you don't know what you're looking for. So if you have a strategy that says, look, we ought to fight al-Qaeda, all right? And then you sit down and say, how do you do that? Well, that's about the best you get because you're looking for 1 in 10 million. And you need tools that can somehow identify them. And I don't know how good those tools are or bad those tools are, but there aren't very many tools. So the real question has to be asked a different way. Assume this is an intrusion on privacy. Would you be willing to give up the hunt for al-Qaeda to protect your privacy? Now, that's an intelligent question, a moral question to ask.
Yeah, I think it is, but I think in America, certainly, you know, I'm a Brit. My view on America has always been the incredibly high importance that Americans place on personal freedom.
Except in times of war. So, for example, during World War II, we had censorship. We basically were subject to search and seizure by all sorts of means. The president used the FBI. So, yes, you're right, in normal circumstances. But at the end of World War II, it ended. The dilemma we have with this war is we don't know how it ends or when it ends. So the Americans during the Civil War, it was Abraham Lincoln who suspended the writ of habeas corpus. So there are two Americas, the one at war, the one at peace. The dilemma we have in this war is not like any other war, both in terms of you're not fighting armies, you're fighting individuals, trying to find them. And more to the point, it just doesn't end. So you can't, there are no victory parades, there's no suspension of the process. And this is a real challenge to the United States. I mean, because the Americans are, as you said, deeply committed to privacy. They're also committed deeply to national security. I mean, these are both, and in this case, the two of them grind against each other. My objection to Snowden is that he made the decision. And I didn't choose him to make the decision. Now, how do we have this debate? It's very difficult to have this debate. We had the debate after Snowden. And the national consensus was, okay, it's a price we're going to pay. And the Germans are also having the debate. But I suspect that if we have information about a terrorist attack in Germany, we don't give it to them, they'll be rather bitter, or the British. So the reality was created by the terrorist movement, by the fact that we can't do nothing, and anything we do is intrusive. So, yeah, it's the important thing is not that they collect information, it's what they do with it. And so far, at least, and this is what's kept the limit on, they've been fairly careful on how to use it.
George, it's been a great pleasure. I don't want to take any more of your time, but thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Great. Thank you.